Welcome. Welcome to our Alberti Center for Bullying Abuse Prevention virtual colloquium on the role of teachers in reducing bullying in schools. My name is Amanda Nickerson, and I'm the director of the Alberti Center here at the University at Buffalo. And we're so excited to be joined by so many of you today from our local partners, some of whom are spending their school break with us today, and colleagues from around the world that are joining us today. Before I introduce our speakers, I just want to review some quick logistics. So the presentation will last about 50 minutes to an hour. We plan to end at or before 12:30, and that's Eastern Standard Time. And that's to allow some time for questions at the end. We'd ask you to please stay muted so we can hear our presenters clearly during the presentation, but you can feel free to type questions into the chat so that the hosts can see them. We also received many questions prior to today, and Dr. Bauman and Dr. Yoon have graciously tried to incorporate as many of these as possible into their talk. So again, we'll have about 10 minutes for questions at the end. And then at about 12:40 Eastern Standard Time, we're going to be sharing the evaluation and leave about 5 minutes for you to do that. We encourage everybody to complete the evaluation, but for those who want continuing professional development documentation hours from the National Association of School Psychologists, we need you to complete that evaluation. And then after that, that'll take you to your certificate. Please also, if you are active on social media, feel free to tweet about what you've learned. And our Twitter account is at @UB_BullyPrevCenter. So I think we'll go ahead and put that in the chat because I know that's a mouthful to remember. So at this time, it is my pleasure to introduce today's speakers, Dr. Bauman and Dr. Yoon. Dr. Sheri Bauman is a professor of counseling at the University of Arizona. She earned her PhD in counseling psychology from New Mexico State University in 1999. And prior to that, she worked in K-12 schools for 30 years as a teacher and school counselor. She's also a retired licensed psychologist. Dr. Bauman conducts research on bullying, cyberbullying, peer victimization, and teacher responses to bullying. She's a frequent presenter locally, nationally, and internationally, and she's authored 7 books, over 65 publications in peer-reviewed journals, and multiple book chapters, as well as 3 training DVDs. She's the former editor for the Journal for Specialists in Group Work and has co-edited 3 special issues related to bullying and cyberbullying. She was also honored with the Eminent Career Award from the Association for Specialists in Group Work in 2018. She's received 2 research grants from the National Science Foundation and is co-PI on a current NSF-funded project to study the effects of teacher practices on peer victimization and defending behaviors. Last but not least, she's on the board of trustees and a research consultant for ditchthelabel.org, an anti-bullying charity. We also have Dr. Jina Yoon, a professor in the Department of Disability and Psychoeducational Studies at the University of Arizona, where she also chairs the school psychology program. Dr. Yoon received her doctorate in school psychology from Texas A&M University and her master's degree in early childhood special education from the University of Texas, Austin. She's a nationally certified school psychologist, as well as a licensed psychologist in Arizona. Her research interests center on social relationships in school environments as an important developmental context, including victimization in school and teacher relationships. Based on the conceptualization that teachers and classroom processes serve as critical socializing experiences, Dr. Yoon's work focuses on identifying specific aspects that contribute to peer victimization. Her previous work includes the role of teachers in peer victimization, including how teachers handle peer victimization incidents reported by teachers and by students, and the role of teachers and parents in prevention and intervention. So without further ado, I'm honored for us to welcome Dr. Bauman and Dr. Yoon.
Well, hello and welcome to our talk, and thank you, Amanda, for such a nice introduction. I'm Sheri Bauman, as you just heard, and Dr. Yoon and I are located in sunny Tucson, Arizona. We're very pleased to have an opportunity like this to share our work and thoughts with you today on this very important topic. To give you an overview, we plan to begin with a review of basic concepts about bullying to make sure that we're all on the same page and all have the same foundational understandings. Then we'll follow with what we know about strategies that are often used by teachers, but that are not effective. We'll describe our theoretical perspective and review findings of research in the field, and then move on to discussing some of the evidence-based and promising approaches for teachers. Of course, there'll be time for questions, as you know. In the limited time we have, we'll not be able to cover everything that we'd like to. And we want to clarify that particularly the topics that are listed on this slide, which some of you noted was of interest to you, will not be covered today. But we want to acknowledge that these are also important and relevant concerns. We also realize that most of you are not teachers, but you're in a position to either consult with or support teachers, train teachers, or conduct research with teachers. So we hope our recommendations will be useful for you in all of those roles. Overall, we hope to stimulate your thinking about strategies and techniques that center the teacher's influence on the dynamics of classroom and peer groups to reduce school bullying and victimization. So here's the basics. We assume that these are common knowledge, but as you'll see, research suggests that that's not always the case. So please bear with us for a moment if this is a little basic for you. We just absolutely want to make sure everybody has the same understandings. So first, bullying is a form of aggression with the intent to harm, repetition, and an imbalance of power between the perpetrator and target that makes it difficult for the target to defend themselves. Second, bullying involves more actors than just a bully and a victim. Christina Salmavalli's seminal work highlighted the various roles that are involved in a bullying event, including assistants and encouragers of the bully, bystanders, hopefully defenders of the victim, and they're all involved. Bullying can also be physical, but also verbal, which is name calling, cruel teasing, threats, and relational acts that damage friendships and peer relationships using things like social exclusion and rumor spreading. And cyberbullying refers to all of these using digital technology. We know by now that involvement in bullying can lead to a variety of negative outcomes, as noted here: academic declines, attendance problems, mental health symptoms, and other adjustment issues. And more recently, we know that there are changes in the brain as well. We study this area because as psychologists, we care about the well-being of young people. And the evidence is very strong that there are harmful and in many cases enduring consequences of involvement in school bullying. Given the prevalence and harmful effects of bullying, educators have naturally looked for approaches to reduce this problem. There are several well-known evidence-based programs that have been found to reduce bullying and victimization, such as the Olveus Bullying Prevention Program from Norway, the Kiva program from Finland, No Trap from Italy, and VISC in Austria, along with various social emotional learning curricula. And all of these are delivered by teachers. However, to be effective, these programs, several of which also involve a cost to schools, should be implemented school-wide and with fidelity, applied consistently, and they require staff support and ongoing training. Well, in practice, those things frequently don't happen. When approaches are haphazard or involve an occasional lesson that someone finds on the internet or an event such as an assembly, without a scope and sequence and follow-up planned, they're unlikely to have a lasting impact and also unlikely to be based on research or theory. Punishment or sanctions is a very widely used strategy by teachers, and while it can be effective in the short term, it also has some drawbacks that we need to be aware of. For example, the punished child learns what not to do, which is often get caught, right? But they don't get instruction or assistance in learning appropriate behaviors, especially if we remove them by suspension or detention or expulsion from school. We also know that the effectiveness of punishment varies with the aversiveness to the student. For example, a student may see suspension as a reward, a chance to play video games all day, rather than an aversive consequence. It also varies with the degree of respect that the person has for the punisher. And unfortunately, some kids don't respect their teachers the way we would hope they would. Punishment can also result in the bullying becoming more secretive or retaliating against the victim, because in their mind, that's who's the cause of the punishment, not their own behavior. Furthermore, the bully may get approval from peers that outweighs any punitive action. Finally, using one strategy to respond to all bullying incidents is just like one size fit all clothing, which doesn't fit anybody very well. And we'll talk more about the importance of customizing interventions to fit the specific situation and context. We're going to share a clip in a moment from the documentary Bully, in which a teacher deals with a case of bullying. These are not actors or role plays, but an actual situation. The filmmaker followed 5 victims during the course of a school year. Prior to this scene, the teacher has spoken with both boys together, and you'll note that this is a credentialed educator who agreed to be filmed across the course of a year. Dr. Yoon, if you would play the video, please.
Right here. I'm going to ask you guys to shake hands. Can you do that? Yeah. Shake hands. Cole. Cole? What? You are not going anywhere. He is offering his hand, and let this drop. You may go. Cole, I expected more.
Because he curses me every single day.
Then why are you around him?
I don't. He comes to me. I try to get away from him. He follows me.
Okay.
And then criticizes me, calling me a PUSSY.
Okay, honey, that's not right. You shouldn't do that.
I don't even know.
But you know what? He was trying to say he was sorry.
He already did, and he didn't mean it. He
You know what?
continued on.
You didn't mean it when you stuck your hand out either. So that means you're just like him, right? What you don't like in him,
They don't
You-
hurt people.
by not
Physically.
shaking his hand, you're just like him.
You're someone who pushes you into walls, threatens to break you off, threatens to stab you and kill
Okay,
you.
he apologized. And have you reported all that sort of stuff?
Yes.
Okay, then it's been
They
taken
told-
care of.
And all of them said, even the cop said, told him, stay away from me. And he
Okay,
doesn't.
all right. Can you try to get along? I think you guys might be really good friends at some time.
We were. And they started bullying.
You know, I've seen this clip, I don't know how many times, and I get upset every single time. I think it's shocking, but it's an illustration of why we need to focus on teachers and teacher training. Incidents like these, in which the targets are re-victimized, are really strong motivators for us in our work. I also know that in the many years that I was a teacher and school counselor, I had no training, zero, about bullying. And I shuddered to think of how I may have handled cases among my students. And then I wondered, did I even recognize them? To me, the good news is that bullying is no longer a secret, and that the myths that it's just a normal part of growing up or preparation for the real world have been pretty much dispelled. What's important here is that tell the teacher is a common advice for anti-bullying efforts. And it's essential then that teachers to whom bullying is reported can take effective action and that they don't make things worse, as I believe happened in this incident. And as also research find it occurs in a proportion of cases. Students receive messages about bullying by observing teachers' behavior, not just hearing what they say. And we know that many of you are not teachers, but you're in a position to advise them and support them or conduct research that ultimately will help teachers become more aware and more effective. Dr. Yoon?
All right, I'm getting there. So one approach that we have taken so far is to look at various ways that teachers may influence students' experience of peer victimization. As Sheri mentioned earlier, teachers are major components of intervention programs, and students are often encouraged to report bullying incidents to teachers. In our earlier work, when we were interested in how teachers responded to bullying incidents, we found very limited discussions about the roles that teachers play. Since then, we have found a strong theoretical rationale and empirical support for both broader and closer look at teachers' roles. For example, we know now from studies with the multi-level analysis that classrooms vary in their climate, but also the rates of victimization. These classroom level differences certainly indicate that the peer ecology specific to each classroom is at work, but also makes us question the way teachers may shape and maintain that specific classroom ecology. So to conceptualize the role of teachers in students' peer victimization experiences, we draw from several theories and models, and we want to have a quick summary of that. First, one overarching framework is the notion of teachers as socializing agents. Similar to the ways that we understand the role of parents in kids' social behaviors, teachers have direct and indirect influences on students' social behaviors. According to Wenzel, teachers have direct influences by modeling specific behaviors, giving advices, and sharing information. Indirect influences through their communication of goals and values and setting rules and expectations for students. What's particularly relevant to our discussion is that in these direct and indirect influences, teachers provide ongoing social experiences through which students learn and internalize these goals and expectations that may dictate their social behaviors. The goal framing theory actually captures that process of indirect influence by teachers. This theory explains that significant adults such as teachers are agents who activate the goals and norms when they handle specific situations. So applied to a bullying incident, the theory actually indicates that the ways that teachers address victimization incidents are likely to activate the goals and the norms that will influence their behavior around peer victimization. So for example, when a teacher dismisses or ignores a report of peer victimization, the response or lack of response in that case contributes to the norm that support the perpetration and further undermines the goal of caring and safety of students for class. Oopsie, there you go. Oh, there you go. So another framework that is relevant to our discussion is Invisible Hand of Teachers by Farmer and his colleagues. It refers to the subtle process of teacher influence on classroom social dynamics and peer relationships. According to this particular approach, the process is actually through ongoing, consistent patterns of teachers' interactions, such as how teachers interact and treat students, resulting in certain level of teacher-student relationships. One important construct in this framework is a teacher attunement, which is teachers' awareness and knowledge of students' social dynamics in classroom. For example, who are in certain groups, who is isolated, who is popular, what hierarchy exists in the classrooms, what types of reputation does a student have. Unfortunately, we know that teachers are not accurate or complete in their assessment of these social dynamics, such as classroom friendship and informal peer groups, or who is victimized in the classroom. This is particularly concerning because teachers' accurate knowledge is critical when we think about their ability to effectively manage social dynamics, with the particular goal of promoting inclusion and social adjustment, as well as reducing risks for social difficulties. So this framework certainly suggests using strategies such as grouping, sitting assignments, and disciplinary practices. But which strategies will be effective or ineffective would largely depend on specific social dynamics. So from these theoretical frameworks, I want to highlight a few important points as a summary. First of all, it is pretty clear that teachers have tremendous influence on students' peer relationships, including peer victimization, defending, and bystander behaviors. And that influence is through their ongoing and consistent pattern of socialization. In the center of this socialization process, there is the teacher-student relationship interactions, and that is how teachers and students interact with each other, creating certain interpersonal contexts and classroom level climate that have implications for students' peer relations. These theories also suggest that the relationship quality cannot be ignored. It is pretty clear that when students have positive relationships with teachers, they're more likely to internalize social goals and expectations that teachers are trying to instill. We could also draw some practical implications from these theoretical frameworks. First of all, the pattern of socialization in the classroom is an important area of prevention and intervention, we argue. In fact, we strongly believe that these proximal processes in the classrooms may be much more influential than larger contexts such as schools. Specifically, the proximal processes such as teaching practices and teacher-student interactions should be targets of prevention and intervention in our view. These theories also suggest that teachers need to be more intentional in their efforts to promote prosocial behaviors and prevent peer victimization. And that needs to be based on accurate knowledge about student social dynamics. So finally, given the role of teachers we have discussed so far, a pressing question is how we support teachers in their efforts to address bullying. We are hoping that our discussion today challenges us and motivate all of us to think about multiple ways to support teachers in this important endeavor.
So given the critical importance of teachers in school bullying, we wondered what the research tells us about their preparation and effectiveness in anti-bullying endeavors. So far, the research suggests that teachers and pre-service teachers are often unable to define bullying completely. They frequently omit power imbalance or repetition. Findings from multiple studies are pretty consistent that teachers and pre-service teachers don't believe they're well prepared with either knowledge or skills to reduce bullying. Other studies have found that some teachers hold attitudes and beliefs that are not helpful. For example, that the causes of bullying are outside their control and therefore there's no point in their trying to make a difference. We also know that teachers and school counselors are most likely to recognize and intervene in physical bullying, then verbal, and then relational, in that order. And we know that relational bullying is extremely damaging, but it's the least frequently recognized or considered serious enough for intervention by teachers. Teachers tend to rely on disciplinary sanctions and are less likely to assist victims or work with bullies in non-punitive ways. In the case of cyberbullying, it's quite interesting because there's still a controversy about whether schools have authority to intervene when the event occurs off campus on personal devices. We need to ensure that teachers understand that the more indirect forms of bullying are also very harmful and that they are prepared to respond to those incidents as well. Teachers in several studies were unable to correctly identify the bullies and victims in their own classes. So not hypothetical, in their own classes. And that included teachers who were delivering a highly rated anti-bullying program. I was quite shocked with that finding. Teachers have also been found in multiple studies to overestimate their effectiveness, to ignore or miss a large percentage of incidents. And studies have found a non-trivial, in my view, of nothing changed or it got worse reports from students. That's 20 to 30% when teachers did intervene. As I said earlier, teachers most often respond with disciplinary measures, less often involving other adults, counselors, colleagues, administrators, or working with and supporting the victim, or working with the bully in a non-punitive way, such as teaching effective pro-social skills and so forth. Teachers very infrequently say they'll ignore the incident, except that observational studies found that they intervene in only a small proportion of incidents. So that's a little confusing. We know that teacher effectiveness varies by a range of factors, including whether they've had training or not, their personal experience of school bullying as a bully or victim or bystander, whether there is or is not a school policy regarding bullying, their own self-efficacy to intervene, and the amount of effort they're willing to expend towards anti-bullying efforts. There have been some demographic differences found, like gender, in the way teachers respond, but the findings aren't consistent or conclusive at this point. Several studies, relatively recent, have attempted to compare authority-based approaches to more supportive strategies. Garando and her colleagues compared a confrontive versus non-confrontive approach for stopping bullying in schools. And overall, there was no significant difference, interestingly, but confronting seemed to be better in secondary schools and in cases of short duration. Vachs and al. Found that the success of teacher interventions as reported by students was also dependent on a number of things: the form of bullying, the student's role in the dynamic, and the type of intervention. And of the three, supportive cooperative, working with a group, was the most effective compared to authoritarian punitive and supportive individual interventions. So this tells us that there aren't easy answers to the many complex questions that we have about teachers and bullying prevention and intervention. There are some approaches to reducing and bullying in schools that merit our attention here briefly. For example, restorative practices, as distinct from peer mediation, hold the bully accountable within a system of support for all parties, including the perpetrator. The goal is to acknowledge that harm has been done without denigrating any individual participants, to understand that reparation from the harm is needed to repair the relationships and the community in which it exists. That is, acknowledging it's not just the bully and victim who've been harmed. Now, people need to be well trained in this method. It has very specific guidelines and steps for restorative conferences and circles, which are facilitated dialogues to repair the harm. That includes even where people sit and who's where and so forth. There's limited research, and what we have is qualitative, but one school district, Denver, I know some of you from Colorado, there were, among 13 restorative cases that were handled, they found that suspension rates reduced for overall and also for demographic subgroups. There are also several approaches to support groups to handle bullying in schools. I happen to like Sue Young's method of support groups. She's a bullying coordinator at a district in the UK. And in 1 2-year period, she used support groups for 55 cases, 51 of which were elementary. And in the primary school, of those 51 cases, 1 wasn't completed because the child left the school, but there was immediate success. That is, only 1 meeting was needed in 80% of the cases. And there was success, but somewhat delayed. It took 3 to 5 meetings in 14% of cases, and limited success in only 5%, which means there was some improvement, but still some bothersome elements. As you heard, I'm a counseling professor. Brief solution-focused counseling is an approach that can be used in individual work with both bullies and victims. And it's structured to build on past successes, exceptions to the problem when it's not happening or when it's less, and a view of the preferred future. The scaling technique, how happy are you in school, with 10 being the happiest ever and 1 being I'm miserable, is also useful for evaluating. So Sue Young also used this approach for 118 referrals. 26 of those only had 1 session, which is common because it's brief. Of the 92 that had more than 1 session, 92% of those increased from needing support to not needing support, and 8% stayed the same or had only small progress. So here's the point. While these approaches may be very useful, they're typically implemented by someone other than the classroom teacher. Now, it could be a teacher that has specialized training and a specialized assignment, or a school counselor or a school psychologist. Teachers need to be aware of when a referral for such approaches is indicated, and the other providers need to be equipped to utilize these.
As part of what works and what's promising, let's talk about teacher-student relationships and possible link to bullying experiences among students. It is well established in the literature that teacher-student relationship is a critical relational context for positive youth development. The studies also point out that the relationship may be related to peer relationships and how students interact with each other. For example, students report of teacher-student relationships characterized as caring, warm, and supportive is related to positive peer relationships and less victimization. In a couple of studies by Thornburg and his colleagues, it was also related to more defending behaviors in classrooms with these types of teacher-student relationships present. What's interesting here is that teacher-student relationship was related to students' autonomous motivation for defending others and negatively related to extrinsic motivation. The examples of autonomous motivations are like, I defend because I like to help others, or I defend because I think it's important to help people who are treated badly. The examples of extrinsic motivations are, I defend to become popular, or I help out because I don't want to get punished. So this particular findings about students' motivation to defend actually suggest that close and warm teacher relationships with students not only motivate students to defend victims, but also facilitate that internalization of values and beliefs that support defending behaviors. So, excuse me. When teacher-student relationship was examined along with the classroom level social characteristics, teachers who are supportive and sensitive tend to have more reciprocated friendships, more pro-social behaviors, and less bullying in their classrooms. In a study by Change and others, the teacher-student relationship moderated the relationship between aggression and rejection. So that is, when teachers were sensitive and supportive, the aggressive kids were less rejected by peers in the classroom. It is also important to note that these relationship qualities with students is related to classroom level characteristics beyond individual students' report, because it certainly points that the relationship qualities are clearly linked to classroom climate and norms. In addition to the positive relationships with the students, teachers' conflicts with students seem extremely important for peer ecology. For example, Hendrick's 2016 study found that when teachers showed more conflicts with students in that classroom reported more disliking for each other in their classrooms. So it seems extremely important to look at ongoing interactions between teachers and students, and to pay particular attention to the way that these interactions may influence peer relationships and social dynamics in the classroom. There are several areas of teacher practices that I find relevant to intervention and prevention efforts. First, I want to highlight the importance of teacher attitudes and behaviors towards specific students. Several works by White and her colleagues in late 1990s and early 2000s show that how teachers react to specific students is related to how much their peers like them. Jan Hughes and her colleagues further argue that teacher support and the conflict for certain students serve as a social referent for peer relations. So these findings further illustrate a powerful process of how teachers may contribute to the underlying social landscape of classroom and peer groups. Through these interactions with students, teachers also communicate approval or disapproval of certain behaviors. But the way it is expressed may also communicate certain levels of teacher liking or disliking of student. One mechanism of teacher influences may be through emotional tones that are embedded in these interactions and exchanges between teachers and students. For example, when a teacher's negative interactions with a particular student is so pervasive and predictable, the interactions will elicit negative affects among peers and create affective biases toward that student, which may also increase the vulnerability of that student for peer difficulties. As you can imagine, these subtle or not so subtle affective tones are difficult to study and document in our understanding. So one example is the interaction between teachers and minority students, including racially, culturally, linguistically marginalized students, LGBTQ youth, or students with disability. We recognize that teachers' bias, negative interactions with these students will make a significant contribution to a peer ecology that reflects a hierarchy of power and privileges. And in return, making these students particularly vulnerable for peer victimization. In fact, there are some evidence suggesting that teachers' approach to diversity is linked to peer victimization. For example, Gates and colleagues found that teachers' respect for diversity and respect for students' individual differences predicted a decrease in classroom level peer victimization over time. Race and colleagues also found that there were less aggression in middle school classrooms when teachers cultivated cultural diversity or cultural sensitivity and students participated in rule-making process. So we believe that this is an important, extremely important area of bullying intervention and prevention that deserves significant attention at this point. How do we create classroom experiences, social experiences with equity, respect, and sensitivity in mind? How do we support teachers so that their classroom interactions with the students reflect their unwavering commitment to all students' safety and more cohesive and less divisive classrooms? So as mentioned earlier, how teachers handle bullying incidents is important for several reasons. In these incidents, teachers can respond in ways to address current bullying behaviors and support victims, as well as to prevent future incidents. More importantly, the incidents serve as an opportunity for teachers to activate the norms and goals that denounce peer victimization and encourage prosocial behaviors. And those norms and goals are likely to influence the future experiences and behaviors of bullies, victims, and other students in class. I think we can all agree that the need for professional development and training for teachers and pre-service teachers is quite obvious here. But equally important is that we evaluate the extent to which these trainings lead to meaningful changes in teacher practices and ultimately students' peer relationships. We noticed that many existing programs have a component that involves teachers, but its impact on teacher practices is rarely examined currently. We also encourage all of us to consider teachers' general classroom management with respect to teacher-student interactions. I don't think it's surprising to see the connection between the classroom management and the bullying experiences. Casas and colleagues found that positive teacher management, as measured by teachers' personal involvement in activities, teacher support to students, was related to less victimization in a sample of students in Spain. Also, in a sample of 4th to 6th graders in Norway, Roland and Galloway found that teachers' management was directly related to less victimization. They also found a significant indirect effect on social dimensions of the class, such as norms about peer relations and teacher authorities. Another interesting concept here related to classroom management is students' perceptions of how fairly their teachers treat them. In a study by Elliott and colleagues, it was related to students' willingness to report an act of bullying. So in terms of teacher practices, we currently have a project that will empirically test the effects of classroom management, teacher handling of bullying, teachers' cultural sensitivity on classroom level bullying and defending behaviors in 4th and 5th grade classrooms. We will have about 87 classrooms, and we'll be using classroom observations and teacher-student reports. We are quite excited about this project because we hope that the data will help us give more information, help us delineate the process of this classroom level teacher influences on peer victimization. So one approach I'm particularly excited about is to explore ways to utilize existing learning activities and curricula in schools. Certainly this will be a more preventive approach, as Swearer and Wang have argued in the past. As many of you are aware, any school-based interventions or anti-bullying initiatives are quite challenging. Schools face significant pressure for academic achievement, and there are so many different competing demands. But because of these and other challenges, I believe the new programs or initiatives are not sustained over time or not fully implemented. So by utilizing existing learning opportunities, there may be less burden in terms of time commitment and costs. More importantly, this approach deserves a lot more attention from a prevention perspective I discussed earlier. That is, teachers can use classroom instruction as a way to socialize children toward anti-bullying and pro-social behaviors. For example, the teachers can guide classroom discussions around social goals, such as respecting, accepting, and helping. One example is the social studies. As a content area, I think the social studies is an ideal home for exploring issues of power and equity and oppression, and also for cultivating concerns for the rights and welfare of others. However, from our focus group with teachers, social studies teachers, we have learned that social studies often cover contents for students to learn and memorize, such as facts and dates. And teachers often shy away from difficult conversations in the classroom and rarely discuss practical implications of those materials for the ways that students treat each other. Another area that has gained some attention is the language arts. For example, the bullying literature project by Wang and her colleagues uses the children's storybooks to increase awareness about bullying and encourage pro-social problem solving. I think the next step is to develop materials and resources and make them available for teachers' use in the classroom. For the social studies, we plan to review and analyze the current middle school curriculum and hopefully develop lesson plans and supporting materials for easy adaptation into classroom instructions for teachers. Okay, so earlier we highlighted the importance of teacher attunement. studies support that teachers who are attuned to peer affiliations tend to have a stronger anti-bullying norms in their classes. And their students report greater sense of belonging, and they're more willing to defend victims. So the approach to support teachers and train teachers on peer victimization, social structures, and peer affiliations is a promising area. For example, one study by Ham and her colleagues found that following a professional development program, teachers' knowledge has significantly improved, and that was related to students' improved perceptions of their social environment. So considering the multiple layers of peer relations and differing peer status in a classroom, teachers' accurate knowledge of these peer dynamics and affiliations could guide our intervention efforts. Next, Sheri is going to illustrate that point.
So regarding the social dynamics that operate in the peer ecology or the classroom community, we learn from social network analysis that there are many different dynamics and configurations of roles in the classroom. And as I mentioned earlier, that means that the same approach is unlikely to work equally well with such different contexts. And for example, an isolated friendless bully versus a popular high status bully, or a provocative versus a passive victim, for example. So this is a simplified graphic illustration of two different patterns. The arrows represent relationships in the classroom, nominations for friendship. This kid's my friend. The most obvious difference is that on the left, the bully has reciprocal friendships with everyone except the victim, who they consider a friend. This person may use bullying to maintain their high status in the peer group. And punishing the bully alone is unlikely to change the behavior because it's working for them. And they may see the punishment as a minor inconvenience compared to the peer approval they get. Encouraging other avenues to attain status, arts, sports, student government, while also developing skills in empathy may help. Some of the strategies we mentioned earlier could also be useful. And notice that students 2 and 3 are friends with both the bully and the victim, and they might be helpful as models for pro-social behavior. Actions such as student seating rearrangement and intentional group composition for group projects and activities could benefit from having this kind of information. In the figure on the right, you'll note that the bully has no friendship nominations. And although they think of student 3 as a friend, the victim, on the other hand, has 2 reciprocal friendships, one of whom is student 3. So students 1, 2, and 3 could serve as bystanders, but be supported in becoming defenders. So very simple illustration to understand that the dynamics and relationships call for the need for more tailored interventions when bullying occurs. I'm mindful of time. I'm going to do a quick run through on our summary. We want to leave you with a few key takeaways. School bullying is a problem around the world. Teachers are key players. There is no, sorry folks, best way for teachers to respond. And the many factors need to be considered: the type, the duration, the severity, the location in the social network of the various actors, school policies, resources available. Teachers need to know how to prevent bullying and how to detect it when it occurs, how to evaluate the severity of an incident, and how to customize interventions based on social networks in the class. And teacher training programs should teach a variety of anti-bullying strategies and approaches. Teachers' relationships and interactions with students are absolutely key and influential in the peer ecology. Teachers are socializing agents, setting up and enforcing norms, modeling appropriate interpersonal communication, and creating and managing a classroom climate that either discourages or condones bullying. In fact, we want to emphasize that we believe that teacher relationships with students and their overall classroom management practices may be the best target for training teachers to reduce bullying. We encourage research among you to continue to investigate how teachers can be best prepared to be effective anti-bullying agents. And we encourage teacher training programs to make certain that such preparation, is an important part of the curriculum. We would like to acknowledge our research team that's working on our current project that Dr. Yoon described, and thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much for such a rich and informative and engaging presentation. We really appreciate it. I did want to remind people, we had a couple questions about this, that the slides and recording and references will be available on our website after the talk. So now if people would like to put questions in the chat, you are more than welcome to, and I'm going to read a couple that have come in while you were talking. One was a question if you have any recommendations for resources or websites regarding some of the restorative practices that you spoke about.
I don't have those at the tip of my finger, but I do have a list of those. Perhaps I can add those to the references or send them to you to pass along. There are some excellent books and videos, and there's also a formal organization that trains in restorative practices that I highly recommend.
Excellent. Yeah, we can definitely send that out to, excuse me, to participants afterwards. Similarly, we had a practical application question. If you're aware of any software programs or perhaps organizations that might do some of the social network analysis that you spoke about for schools.
This is funny. We have a grand design, a grandiose project that looks like it won't be funded first round, but we're going for it. We want to create an app that can be used in the classroom by kids on their phones or whatever device they have that will produce the maps that, like the one, simplified ones that we showed teachers. Right now, it seems that teachers who want that kind of, mapping and certain statistical things will have to partner with a researcher who's able to do that. It's a statistical procedure, and it's too complex to expect teachers to know how to do it, but I think there are many researchers that would love to partner with them.
So while we are figuring that out and getting funding to develop this friendly app for teachers, I think there are a few ways to think about what teachers can do to better understand classroom dynamics. So one example is Class Map by Beth Dole. She's at the University of Nebraska in Lincoln. And her work actually really kind of looks into classroom ecology. And she uses the survey items to kind of gauge what types of climate and what types of peer relationships that they have. And I think that may be excellent way to kind of get into that work to understand the social map in the classroom.
Thank you. Excellent. I put that in the chat as well. Another question that came in was, it seemed like a lot of the research was focused on primary grades. Are the recommendations limited to primary school, and or do you have any recommendations that might be based more on research for middle or high school?
I just point out that the Garando and Vox studies did both, and several of the others, although we didn't specify middle, so they're not all elementary. I think the advantage of elementary is that the students are self-contained with one teacher, so they make an ideal object of research. Dr. Yoon, would you like to add?
We actually, when we think about teacher influences on kids and what the unit of socialization that is happening, we really struggle with the idea of secondary school where there's a multiple classrooms and there are multiple teachers socializing kids. So I think there is some challenge in terms of looking at that in a secondary level. But I think we do have enough evidence to suggest that the school climate issues in a personal context are a critical part of environment that either encourages or deters peer victimization. And so I think that's something that we need to think about, excuse me, in terms of the research, in terms of analysis. What is the unit of analysis when we think about the teacher socializing efforts toward certain goals and norms? That's kind of a continuing struggle for me personally. How do we conceptualize that?
I would add that that's one of the reasons I think, particularly at secondary level, if you don't have everyone on board to a philosophy or a program that you're using, it becomes disjointed because they have so many different teachers and groups of students. So as Dr. Yoon just said, the climate and some of the strategies and philosophies and policies, if they're consistent across the school, that's much more effective than when at the secondary level because of the numbers and complexity of those interactions.
In fact, Dewey Cornell's school climate measure actually looks at the interpersonal context in a secondary level as well, although it's not really tied to individual teachers.
Right.
Whereas in the primary level, we have a pretty clear unit, classroom context. So that allows us to look at specific impact of teachers' actions on students. The project that we're doing is really, we're excited about it because we will be able to look at the classroom level peer victimization and defending behaviors.
That sounds really exciting. So another question that came in, when working with partners, so districts or after school programs, what are your thoughts on answering the question about stopping bullying without being too pessimistic or making it sound too insurmountable? I think that comes from a perspective of a lot of us will say, well, there is no silver bullet kind of thing. So how in the dialogue might you address that?
I frequently talk with schools, and yes, there is no silver bullet, but there are many promising practices, and they need to look at their own particular context and environment and district level constraints and so forth, and look at what's going to fit their school best. It could be, for example, that they decide to incorporate restorative practices, train a few individuals, and make that sort of the go-to approach for that school. It could be that they focus on teacher training rather than implementing program at the student level. So I think while there's no magic bullet for everyone, at the school level, they can really analyze. I always encourage them to do a needs assessment and survey their students, what's going on and where and how, and then design your approach based on the information about your school rather than everyone's school or a school in another state or country that may not apply. So that's one thing, is that there's not one magic bullet, but there are a lot of promising strategies.
Mm-hmm. And I think it's when I think about the real changes, it's a process, right? So we start with a need assessment and identify what needs to be done, how serious the problem is, and where is it happening. What are influencers, all that kind of information. But also, it's not just a one-time deal. I think sometimes we look for a simple answer for a very complicated problem that we need to deal with. So, there are some studies that suggest that teacher training doesn't work. When we actually looked at, Sheri and I looked at how teachers respond to peer victimization, in a couple of samples, we found that having training, having gone through training, didn't really make any difference in terms of how they responded to those vignettes. So, which is kind of disappointing, right? But I think if you think about the real substantial changes that needs to happen from these professional training and developments, we need to engage in an ongoing process, not just one time, one afternoon, couple of hours where we talk about prevalence and significant problems. I think we really need to think about ways to create that ongoing conversation in the school building so that teachers are constantly evaluating what's happening, how they are addressing it, and how students are responding. That's kind of big message that I want to send out.
Thank you. So another question is, we're in the COVID-19 context still. So a lot of the important things you talked about in terms of teacher and student relationship, and also, identifying and intervening with peer problems and bullying. Any insights or recommendations from your work about how to best approach this in the virtual context?
Well, as you know, this is something none of us have dealt with before. We had the opportunity to observe some virtual classes, and it appeared, and I want to acknowledge that these were limited numbers of observations in classrooms, that peer interaction was discouraged, and that the interactions in the classroom were student to teacher. There weren't activities designed to help students get to know one another. It seemed like the assumption was we need to get the kids concentrating and focusing on the academics because the time is limited and we still need to teach and so forth. So one recommendation I would have would be that we still need to devote some time to build solid peer relationships, help them learn, deliver social emotional curriculum, not haphazardly again, but have a systematic approach to those things, and not to put them on the back burner just because we're virtual, because they're going to come back together someday. And to definitely look at breakout rooms, but facilitated breakout rooms and so forth, if they're using these kinds of software to encourage peer interaction and model respectful behavior. That's my short answer.
The other thing that I saw in the classroom observations that I've done so far, virtual classrooms, was the teacher-student ratio was pretty large. I think we somehow make assumption that, that one teacher can handle a lot of kids because it's a virtual, right? So one classrooms, there were about 34 kids and one teacher. And I think it was 4th grade classrooms. And I think about two things. One is teacher-student relationships, the quality, actions. And I don't think a teacher could actually see all of students in one screen at that point. But also, how do we encourage students positive peer relations and interactions in that kind of environment? And I found it very challenging to even think about how kids are doing socially in that kind of environment. So it was really eye-opening experience just to see some of the virtual classrooms last fall, 2020. And I think the virtual learning is going to stay. I don't think it's going to go completely even after the pandemic. So I think that will be another area of research, how we promote teacher-student relationships and peer relationships on virtual setting. I think that will be a really nice area of research in the future.
And to see what happens when they utilize small group activities and so forth, because it was really an eye-opener to see 34 little heads and one teacher whose lesson was fabulous, except, some of the kids, a lot of the kids had their cameras off, so they're not even seeing each other. And we have to respect privacy at the same time. We want to not ignore this very important aspect of education. It's not just reading and math, but we're educating future citizens, and we're educating, neighbors and members of our society. So I think the message regarding virtual learning is that we can't ignore yes, it's more challenging, But it's even more important as a result because the kids are not interacting in the way they're accustomed to. For some kids, school is where they make friends and learn social skills, and they're not doing it.
Yeah. Thank you so much. I just want to acknowledge a couple important points that people have messaged to us. Marcia said, just a thought that generally supporting teachers, many of whom are already feeling the strain of the pandemic, is something that may go a long way toward fixing classroom climate. And she agrees with Dr. Yoon about the need to engage in ongoing support of teachers. And then Mark Van Ryzen said, the way to support positive peer interaction is through cooperative or peer learning techniques. These can be done while students are learning, so teachers don't have to set aside time just devoted to supporting peer relations. And those are great points. We also had a comment related to the earlier question about social network analysis, but someone, it sounds like this is a funder, said that some of their grantees are using a startup organization called Bloom Sites that have a social networking analysis and that they use, and the grantees seem to appreciate the data that it provides. And then Mark talked about his research on peer cooperative learning and is happy to share best practices if people want to contact him. So yeah, a lot of the folks that that Dr. Bauman and Dr. Yoon cited in their work are actually here with us today. And so it's you know, such a great opportunity that COVID has given us in some ways to do this virtually. Usually for our colloquium, we do it at UB, and although that's wonderful, you know, in some ways this has opened up more opportunity for us. So I just want to thank you both again so much for your wonderful presentation, your responsiveness to the questions. Dealing with very big questions in a very concise way is definitely a challenge and a skill that we appreciate. Bree has put the feedback link for our survey in the chat. We would really like for everyone to complete that and give us your input. And certainly if you want that NASP documentation of attendance, that's how you get it, is completing the survey. And we also, we've got some priming for this with some of this presentation about social networks, but our next virtual colloquium will be on Tuesday, April 20th from 11:30 to 12:45 again. And Dr. Guy Huitzing, who is our early career award winner, who's on this right now, I believe, will be presenting on targeting persistent cases of bullying with network diagnostics. So I think it'll be a great complement and really continuation of some of the discussion that we've had today. So please follow us on social media, check our website. If you're on our mailing list, you will get all of these announcements as well. So thank you again, and we'll stay on for a couple minutes if people have questions or things about accessing the survey or anything else. And please look forward to seeing the slides and references on our website. So thank you again once again.
Thanks for being
Thanks
here.
everyone.
Thanks for this opportunity. Bye.